Ma'am, are you sure you don't need me to call someone? This doesn't look like something you should be walking off. The woman looked up from the curb where she was sitting, both hands pressed flat against her knees. She had a split on her right eyebrow, dried blood tracking down to her jaw, and the kind of stillness that only comes from a person who has learned to stay very calm in very bad situations. I'm fine. Thank you. She wasn't fine. Anyone could see that. But Corporal Yolanda Dempsey, formerly of the 2nd Canadian Ranger Patrol Group, now unemployed, now sitting on a wet curb outside a gas station in Sudbury, Ontario at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, did not want help. She had not wanted help for 3 years. She had gotten very good at not wanting it. What she wanted was to find her grandmother's nursing home file before the end of the month, because the facility had sent a letter, the third one, saying that unless someone paid $14,800 in arrears by the 31st, Nana Barrel was going to be transferred to a provincial long-term care facility 4 hours north of the city. What she wanted was her truck, which had thrown a belt on the Trans-Canada 3 hours earlier and was now sitting in a ditch 11 kilometers outside of town. What she wanted was to stop bleeding from the eyebrow she'd caught on the tailgate when she climbed out of the cab in the dark. None of those things were happening. So she sat on the curb and she breathed. The man who had asked if she needed help was the attendant from inside. Young, maybe 19, wearing a vest 2 sizes too large. He lingered in the doorway like he wasn't sure what the protocol was for a woman sitting in the parking lot bleeding. She told him she just needed 5 minutes. He nodded and went back inside. Here's what nobody tells you about leaving the military. They brief you on everything: transition assistance, mental health resources, employment programs, how to write a civilian resume. They do not brief you on what it feels like to be the most capable person in a room and still not be able to fix the one thing that matters most. Yolanda had survived 2 northern deployments and 1 flood relief operation where she carried a 60-pound pack through chest-high water for 4 consecutive days. She had won a commendation she wasn't allowed to talk about. She had trained 12 junior rangers who went on to things she was proud of. She could not make $14,800 appear before the end of October. She pushed herself up off the curb, walked inside, and asked to use the phone book. The attendant stared at her. She asked if there was a mechanic anywhere in town who did after hours. He stared at her longer, then pulled out his own phone and looked it up for her. One result: Sterling's Auto, out on Regent Street. The listing said 24-hour emergency road service, family-owned since 1987. She called. It rang 4 times. Then a voice, young, clear, unhurried. "Hello? I've got a truck in a ditch on the Trans-Canada," she said. "About 11K past the Worthington exit. Belt's gone, possibly something with the alternator too. I don't have a card on me, but I can pay cash when I get the truck in." A pause. Not the pause of someone deciding whether she was worth the trouble. The pause of someone thinking, "Okay, give me the exact marker." She heard the tow truck before she saw it. She was standing on the gravel shoulder in the dark, the wind coming off the lake, cold enough to make her eyes water. And then the headlights swung around the bend, and she felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. The specific relief of someone coming. The truck pulled up and the driver got out. She was maybe 26, 27 at the outside. Dark skin, natural hair pulled back under a toque, coveralls over a sweater, work boots that had seen serious use. She moved around the front of the tow truck with the particular efficiency of someone who didn't have extra movement to spare. She took one look at the ditch, one look at Yolanda's truck, and crouched down in the gravel with a flashlight. "Belt's gone," she said. "Can see that from here." "What were you hearing before it went?" "Kind of a high whine. Started about 40 minutes before." She nodded, still looking. She hadn't introduced herself. She seemed to be the kind of person who did the work first. "Okay. The alternator's probably okay. Belt dragged on the way out, but I don't think it took anything else with it." She stood. "I'm going to get this on the truck and take it back to the shop." You can come or I can call you a cab. I'll come. The driver's name, Yolanda found out later, was Renata Sterling, 24 years old. Her father, Victor Sterling, had opened Sterling's Auto in 1987 after arriving in Sudbury from Trinidad with a machinist's certificate and $200. He had run the shop for 31 years until a stroke took him 4 years ago, and Renata had been running it since she was 20. Her mother worked the front desk in the mornings. Her younger brother, Marcus, was in his second year of mechanical engineering at Laurentian. Yolanda learned none of this on the drive. On the drive, Renata asked her what the truck was, a 2007 F-150, and what kind of shape the rest of it was in. And Yolanda told about the rear seal she'd replaced herself last spring and the calibration issue on the passenger brake she'd been meaning to get sorted. Renata listened the way mechanics listen, with her head slightly tilted, processing. The shop was a converted two-bay garage on Regent, the original Sterling sign still over the door in faded gold and burgundy. Inside, it smelled like oil and cold concrete, and faintly, like someone had been making coffee recently. There was a 1991 Civic up on one lift and a cleared bay waiting. Renata backed the F-150 off the tow rig with practiced ease and got it into the bay. She got under it with a creeper before Yolanda had finished setting down her bag. "Give me 20 minutes to really look at it," she said from somewhere underneath. "There's coffee in the back if you want." Yolanda sat on a folding chair near the workbench and drank the worst coffee she had ever tasted in her life and felt, inexplicably, better than she had in months. The shop was quiet, in the way that working spaces get quiet late at night. Not empty, but settled. Tools hung in order on a pegboard. A small whiteboard on the wall had 3 jobs listed in blue marker. The bench itself was an archaeological site of ongoing projects. A rebuilt fuel pump still in its housing, a torque wrench with a tag on it, a parts catalog with a coffee ring on the cover that had been there long enough to go through several coats of grime. In the corner, half visible behind a cabinet, was a framed photograph. A man in coveralls standing in front of this same building, younger and with the same careful posture as the woman currently underneath the F-150. The sign behind him in the photo was brand new. The paint was bright. Yolanda looked at the photo for a long time. She had not planned to say anything. She was not a person who told strangers her business. But it was nearly midnight, and she was bleeding through the cloth she'd been pressing against her eyebrow. And the coffee was truly terrible, and she had not spoken to another person in 4 days, except for the nursing home's billing coordinator and the 1-800 number for her bank. She said, "Is that your father?" Renata's head appeared from under the truck. She looked at the photo. "Yeah, he built this place." Yolanda nodded. She looked down at her hands. "My grandmother is in a nursing home on Elm. She's been there 8 years. She has dementia. She doesn't always know who I am anymore, but she still knows her own kitchen, kind of. They have this little alcove where she sits, and she talks about making bread, and I can't." She stopped. She did not know why she was saying this to a mechanic she had met 45 minutes ago. But Renata had come out from under the truck. She was wiping her hands on a shop rag, and she was listening. Not with sympathy, exactly. With attention. "They're going to move her," Yolanda said. "End of the month if I can't get current. 4 hours north. How much? 14,800. Renata looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked back. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to go back under your truck." Yolanda almost laughed. "Okay." Renata went back under. The sound of the creeper, the tap of metal, the small adjustments. Outside, a late transport hummed down Regent. Yolanda sat with the terrible coffee and the photo of Victor Sterling and the silence. "Stop me right here for a second, because I need you to understand what that number meant. $14,800. Yolanda had $312 in her account. She had an employment insurance payment coming on the 18th that would cover her own rent. She She had a part-time contract with a wilderness training company that paid her $11 over minimum wage for 20 hours a week, which was the only reason she'd been able to keep even that much current. Her credit was fine on paper, but she had no collateral that the bank would look at. She had applied for 2 programs and been declined on technicalities. The kind of technicalities that only exist to give bureaucracies a reason to say no. $14,800 was not an obstacle. It was a wall, and Yolanda Dempsey had been running at it every day for 3 months, and all she had was bruises. She was 29 years old. She had served her country in conditions that would have broken most people. And she could not get $14,800 together before the end of October. That's where Renata Sterling found her, sitting in a folding chair with cold coffee and a bleeding eyebrow. Renata came out from under the truck at just past 1 in the morning. "Belts replaced," she said. "I found a hairline crack in the serpentine bracket. It would have gone within another 200-300 kilometers. I want to check the tensioner before you take it back out." Probably another 40 minutes. Yolanda stood. "What's the damage?" Renata named a number. It was less than Yolanda expected. Not dramatically. Renata was not running a charity. But it was a fair number, the kind of number that assumed the other person's situation without announcing it. Yolanda counted out the cash from the envelope she kept in the interior pocket of her jacket. She handed it over. Renata took it and set it on the bench. She picked up her coffee and looked at Yolanda. "You mentioned wilderness training," she said. "What does that mean?" "Combat qualified," Yolanda said. "Rangers. I do navigation, survival, load-bearing, emergency response protocol. Mostly corporate contracts now, team building." She said this with the flat affect of someone who found the phrase team building faintly insulting. Renata almost smiled. She took the cup to the back and came out with a different cup. "Try this one. I had a second pot going. It was considerably better." They sat in the 2 folding chairs near the workbench, and Renata asked questions. Not intrusive ones, not sympathetic ones, the kind of questions that are just actually curious. Where in the north had she been stationed? What the ranger program looked like on the ground? Whether the wilderness contracts were licensed through the province or through a certification body. Yolanda answered and found herself saying more than she'd planned. Because Renata's questions had the quality of being actually interested in the answers. At some point, she wasn't sure exactly when, Yolanda mentioned the nursing home again, not the money. Just that her grandmother had been the person who taught her to navigate by star position when she was 9 years old, in a field outside Kapuskasing, and that the nursing home staff were good people, but they didn't know that about her. Didn't know that Beryl Dempsey had been a bush pilot's wife and had raised 6 children in remote postings across the north, and had once, at the age of 71, walked 11 kilometers in a whiteout to get help for a stranded snowmobiler. They just knew her as a resident in room 214 who sometimes didn't recognize her family. Renata listened to all of this. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Do you have a business card?" For the training work, Yolanda did not have a business card. She wrote her name and number on the back of the shop receipt. Renata looked at it, folded it, put it in her chest pocket. She went back to work on the truck. Yolanda slept for 45 minutes in the folding chair and woke up when Renata said the truck was done. It was 20 past 2 in the morning. She thought about the shop for 3 days afterward. Not obsessively, just the way you turn something over when it stays with you. The photo of Victor Sterling. The tools hung in order. Renata crouching in the gravel with a flashlight before she'd even said her name. The second pot of coffee. On the Thursday, Gerald Marsh knocked on Yolanda's door. He was the building manager, and he had a smile that didn't reach above his cheekbones. And he wanted to talk about her lease renewal, which happened to be coming up at the same time as the nursing home deadline. And wasn't that something? And he'd been meaning to mention that the 2-bedroom across the hall had gone for significantly more than her current rate. And She let him finish and closed the door. She sat on the floor of her apartment. She had not bought a couch yet. She'd been in the apartment for 14 months, and she had not bought a couch. And she looked at the wall. She thought about her grandmother walking 11 kilometers in a whiteout. She thought about a woman coming out of the dark with a tow truck. She thought about what it would mean to move Beryl Dempsey 4 hours north. She did not have a plan. She had a phone, a receipt, and $312. She also had, somewhere around her rib cage, the specific stubbornness that her grandmother called Dempsey spine, and her commanding officer had called an asset and also, occasionally, a problem. She called the number for the wilderness training contract. She asked if there was any possibility of picking up the unscheduled weekend intensive they'd been having trouble staffing. There was. She took it, even though it paid less per hour because it was technically overflow rate. She called the nursing home and asked for a meeting with the director. They gave her an appointment for the following Tuesday. Then, because she didn't know why exactly, she called Sterling's Auto. Renata picked up on their second ring. She had not called to ask for anything. She called to say thank you properly because her grandmother had raised her to do that, and because she was aware she'd left the shop at 2 in the morning, having slept in a stranger's chair and been given 2 cups of coffee and a fair price on work done in the middle of the night, and she had not managed a complete sentence of gratitude on her way out. Renata said, "You don't have to call to thank me. It's the job." "I know," Yolanda said. "I'm calling anyway." Renata laughed. It was a short laugh, but real. Then Renata said something. She'd told a friend about the wilderness training certification, she said. This friend ran a private training company that contracted with corporate clients and occasionally with government programs, and they'd been looking for a qualified instructor for a Northern Adaptation module for about 8 months, and couldn't find anyone with both the military certification and the experience. Would Yolanda be okay if Renata passed her number along? Yolanda sat down on the floor again. "Yeah," she said, "that would be okay." She tried to ask what she owed Renata for that. Renata said, "It's nothing. I just mentioned it. It was not nothing." That was a referral to a contract that paid. As it turned out, when the company called on Friday, 4 times what Yolanda was making on the weekend overflow rate. It was a 6-month engagement, renewable. It started in 3 weeks. Yolanda stood in her kitchen for a long moment after she hung up. Then she sat down at the table. She had a table. The apartment had a table and a bed and not much else, and she wrote out the numbers, the contract, the EI, the training overtime she'd just picked up, the gap. It was still a gap, not $14,800. But it was closer, and it was a door, and she had been staring at a wall for 3 months. She was going to make it. It was going to be close and it was going to hurt, but she was going to make it. She did not know yet about Victor Sterling. She found out later, weeks later, after things had already changed in ways she hadn't seen coming, that Victor Sterling had served. Not the Canadian Rangers. He was Trinidadian-born and came to Canada in his late 20s. But he had done 2 years with the Trinidad and Tobago Regiment before he emigrated, and he had always, Renata said, maintained the belief that when someone in uniform or formerly in uniform needed help, you gave it without commentary and without waiting to be asked. She found out that Renata had been awake the night Yolanda called. Not because she kept late hours, but because it was the 4th anniversary of Victor's stroke. That she had been sitting in the shop, in the folding chair, because she sometimes did that when it was quiet. That she had answered the phone at 11:30. Not because it was a business call, but because it was something to do, and because her father would have answered it. She found out that the friend Renata had mentioned, the one with the training company, had actually been reached at 7 in the morning the day after, because Renata had been up already and had thought about it overnight. That she had specifically said, "She's the real thing. Give her a proper contract." She did not find this out for weeks, and by then other things had happened. Yolanda was in the shop on a Saturday in late October. Her truck needed a winter service, and she'd started going to Sterling's as a matter of course, in the way that you go back to the mechanic who didn't oversell you and made you coffee at 2 in the morning when a woman came in the front door. She was maybe 70, small, a good coat, a slight difficulty with the door that she didn't let slow her down. Renata came out from the back, and the woman's face changed. Rennie, Victor's mother. Yolanda put that together later. She had come in to drop off something. A container of food, it looked like, the kind wrapped in foil that means somebody's been cooking since before you were awake. And she stayed for 20 minutes in the back while Yolanda sat in the waiting area. When she came back through, she stopped and looked at Yolanda, the particular, direct look of someone assessing. "You're the one Renata towed in from the highway," she said. Yolanda stood out of habit. "Yes, ma'am." The woman looked at her for a long moment. She had eyes like she'd seen a great deal and had sorted it all out already. Victor always said. She told her that you can tell a person's character by how they behave when they're stranded. Whether they panic, whether they lie about the situation, whether they thank the person who helps them. She picked up her handbag. He was right about most things. She nodded once, as if settling something, and left. Yolanda sat back down. She looked at the workbench through the door to the bay, the tools in order, the photo on the wall, the parts catalog with the coffee ring. Renata came back out carrying the foil container. "That's my grand," she said. "Odessa. She feeds everyone." I noticed. Renata set the container on the desk. She looked at Yolanda for a moment. "How's your grandmother?" "Still in room 214, Yolanda said, "but I made the October payment, and November's going to be closer." Renata nodded slowly. "Do you know," Yolanda said, "why I called you that night? Sterling's, I mean. It was the only listing. But also, the attendant at the gas station looked it up for me, and what came up said family-owned since 1987. That's why I called that one first. I don't know why that mattered to me at the time. It just did." Renata was quiet for a moment. "My dad used to say that," she said. "Family-owned is just a way of saying someone cares more about their name than their profit margin." He put it in every ad. The contract started on the 1st of November. It was hard work, the good kind, the kind Yolanda had been doing all her life and had not had enough of since leaving the service. The clients were a mixed group: government emergency response planners, 2 corporate risk managers, 1 federal program officer who turned out to have done her own time in a search and rescue auxiliary 20 years prior, and who ran a 5-kilometer course in conditions that impressed even Yolanda. She went home at the end of the first week and slept 9 hours. She made the November payment. She made the December payment. She did not make the January payment in full. She was $2,000 short and had to call the director and negotiate. But she made it by the 15th, and the director, a man named Beaumont, who Yolanda had initially filed under bureaucrat and later revised to decent person doing a hard job, met her partway on the timeline. She was in to see her grandmother twice a week now. Beryl Dempsey was having a good stretch, not always remembering dates or names, but remembering patterns, sequences, the logic of things. She sat in her alcove and told Yolanda about a winter in Moussigny in 1971 when the supply plane was a week late and she'd stretched a week of groceries to 11 days without anyone going hungry. She told her about her husband Aubrey, Yolanda's grandfather, who had died before Yolanda was born, and how he could read the weather in the cloud formations over James Bay. "You have his eyes," Beryl told her, "and his stubbornness." "I know," Yolanda said. "I've heard that." Beryl patted her hand and went back to the window. In February, Renata Sterling got a call from a number she didn't recognize. The woman on the other end introduced herself. She worked for a private foundation, not a government body, not an NGO, something smaller and specifically targeted, that identified and supported small businesses in Northern Ontario owned by Black Canadians. They had been looking at Sterling's Auto for 8 months. They had made some inquiries. The number they'd been given, repeatedly, when they asked around in the community about who ran an honest shop, was Sterling's. They were offering a grant, not a loan, infrastructure funding for a second location, a training bay, and the launch of an automotive apprenticeship program specifically designed to recruit young people from underrepresented communities in greater Sudbury and the surrounding areas. $700,000. Renata sat down on the shop floor. She called her mother, who cried. She called her brother Marcus at Laurentian, who said he'd come home for the summer to help get the training program launched. She did not call Yolanda, but Yolanda found out because Sudbury is not a large city, and Sterling's auto was well known, and it was in the local paper in late February, a short piece with a photograph of Renata in front of the shop under the original sign. Yolanda read it in the break room of the training facility, on her phone between sessions. She stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she called. Renata picked up on the second ring, same as always. "I saw the paper," Yolanda said. "Yeah." Renata sounded like she still hadn't quite believed it herself. "Yeah, it's real." Yolanda said, "Your dad would have been proud." Long pause. "Yeah," Renata said quietly. "I think so." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I want to put you down," Renata said, "as a first referral for the apprenticeship program, for the combat and navigation module, when we get it launched, if that's something you'd consider." Yolanda thought of her grandmother in her alcove. She thought of the photo on the wall of the shop. She thought of a tow truck coming around a bend in the dark, headlights cutting through. Someone coming. "I'd consider it," she said. On a Thursday evening in early March, Yolanda went to Sterling's to pick up her truck after a routine winter check. The shop was quiet, just Renata and one of her part-timers running late on a fleet job. Odessa had been in that morning. There was another foil container on the desk, half gone. Renata came out wiping her hands and gave Yolanda the rundown on the service. Everything routine. Truck was in good shape. She had replaced the wiper blades without being asked and wasn't charging for them. Yolanda counted out the payment, handed it over. Then she reached into her jacket and put a card on the counter. It was a business card. She had finally bought business cards. Dempsey Wilderness Solutions. Phone number. A simple insignia. A compass rose, no text. She had had 50 printed. She'd given out 43. Renata picked it up, looked at it. "For when the apprentices need a navigation instructor," Yolanda said, "and for anything else you think it's useful for." Renata nodded once. Put it in the same chest pocket she'd put the handwritten receipt 6 months earlier. They stood in the shop for a moment. The heater ran. Outside, snow was coming down on Regent Street, thick and quiet. "How's your grandmother?" Renata asked. "Good week," Yolanda said. "She told me about navigating by Orion's Belt last Tuesday. She was very specific. She remembered the exact degrees." Renata smiled. "That's good, it is." Yolanda picked up her keys. She paused at the door, because the door of Sterling's had a small bell that rang when you opened it, and she had come to associate that sound with something she had not had a name for until recently. The feeling of a place where someone did right by you. She thought of something her grandmother had told her the previous week, in one of those moments that cut through the fog with complete clarity. "You don't run toward the people who make everything easy, girl. You run toward the people who show up in the dark." Yolanda opened the door. The bell rang. She drove home through the snow, and the truck ran clean the whole way.